The morning I discovered 3 weeks of my marketing reports had mysteriously vanished from the company server, I knew something was terribly wrong. My hands trembled as I clicked through folder after folder, desperately searching for files I distinctly remembered saving. 27 years at Patterson Marketing Solutions, and I'd never lost a single document. If you enjoy dramatic life stories like this one, smash that like button and subscribe. Tell us where you're watching from. My name is Margaret Cook. I'm 63 years old, and I pride myself on being meticulous with my work. Every presentation, every client analysis, every quarterly report gets saved in triplicate with timestamps. It's a habit that served me well throughout my career, especially since I started working closely with Derek Morrison 2 years ago. Derek was the golden boy of our department, 34 years old, MBA from Northwestern, and possessed of that particular brand of confidence that made upper management swoon. He'd joined our team as a senior analyst, and I'd been assigned to mentor him on our client relationships. At first, I was flattered. Derek seemed eager to learn, always asking detailed questions about my processes and requesting copies of my templates. "Margaret, you're absolutely brilliant at client retention strategies," he'd said just last month, leaning over my shoulder as I worked on the Henderson account presentation. "Would you mind sharing your research methodology? I want to make sure I'm following your excellent example." I'd been touched by his admiration and gladly shared everything. After all, knowledge was meant to be passed down, wasn't it? But now, staring at my empty project folders, Derek's voice echoed differently in my memory. Yesterday morning, our department head Patricia Williams had called me into her office with a concerned expression. "Margaret, I need to discuss the Henderson presentation with you. Derek mentioned you hadn't completed the quarterly analysis we discussed last month?" My stomach had dropped. "Patricia, I submitted that analysis 3 weeks ago. It should be in the shared drive under the Henderson folder." "I've looked everywhere, and Derek checked as well. There's no record of your submission." Patricia's tone was gentle but firm. "Derek had to work overtime last weekend to complete what he thought you'd already finished." The memory made my chest tighten with anxiety. I'd immediately rushed back to my desk to prove Patricia wrong, only to find exactly what I was looking at now. Nothing. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table, still reeling from the day's events. My daughter, Sarah Cook, arrived for our weekly dinner. Her nurse's uniform wrinkled from a long shift at the hospital. At 38, Sarah had inherited my attention to detail and my stubborn streak. "Mom, you look terrible," she said, dropping her purse by the door and immediately moving to put the kettle on. "What's wrong?" "I think I'm losing my mind, honey." I explained the missing files, Derek's claims, and Patricia's disappointed expression. 27 years, Sarah. I've never missed a deadline or lost work. But what if I'm getting forgetful? What if this is the beginning of... Stop right there." Sarah's voice was sharp as she joined me at the table with 2 steaming mugs of tea. "Mom, you balanced your checkbook to the penny last week. You remembered my friend Lisa's birthday when I forgot it. You're not losing your mind. Then how do you explain the missing files?" Sarah's dark eyes, so like my own, narrowed thoughtfully. "Tell me about this Derek person again." As I described Derek's helpfulness, his constant questions, his requests for my templates and methods, Sarah's expression grew increasingly skeptical. "Mom, in nursing, we have a saying, when you hear hoofbeats, think horses, not zebras. The simplest explanation is usually the right one. Which is? Someone doesn't want you to succeed." The next morning, I decided to confide in my closest friend at work, Linda Hoffman. Linda and I had started at Patterson Marketing on the same day 27 years ago, fresh-faced and eager to prove ourselves in the corporate world. We'd weathered office politics, difficult clients, and 3 different management restructures together. I found Linda in the break room, stirring cream into her coffee with the same methodical precision she brought to her accounting work. "Linda, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." She looked up, immediately sensing the seriousness in my tone. "Of course, Margaret. What's going on?" I told her everything: the missing files, Derek's claims, Patricia's concerns, and Sarah's theory. Linda listened without interruption, her expression growing more troubled with each detail. "Margaret," she said slowly, "I wasn't sure if I should mention this, but last Friday, I saw Derek at your computer after hours. When I asked what he was doing, he said you'd asked him to check on some files for you." My blood ran cold. I never asked him to do anything on my computer. "I know. That's why I found it odd. You're not the type to have someone else handle your work." Linda glanced around the empty break room and lowered her voice. "There's something else. Derek's been asking me questions about your client relationships, your work methods. He said he was trying to maintain continuity in case you decided to retire soon." "Retire? I have no plans to retire." That's what I told him, but he seemed convinced you were planning to step back. He even asked about your computer password protocols. The pieces were starting to form a horrible picture. Derek hadn't been admiring my work. He'd been studying it, copying it, and now he was systematically making me look incompetent. "Linda, I need your help. If what I'm thinking is true, if Derek is somehow accessing my files and deleting them after copying my work, then he's not just stealing your projects, he's destroying your reputation to cover his tracks." Linda's voice was grim. "Margaret, this is serious. If Patricia thinks you're becoming unreliable, especially at your age—" She didn't need to finish the sentence. In a youth-obsessed corporate culture, being perceived as a declining older employee was a death sentence. That evening, I paced my living room while Sarah sat on the couch, her laptop open, researching corporate data theft policies. "Mom, you need to document everything," she said, looking up from her screen. "Every missing file, every time Derek was near your workstation, every conversation with Patricia. We need to build a case." "But how do I prove something that's already been deleted? It's my word against his, and he's the rising star while I'm the aging employee who might be losing her edge." Sarah closed her laptop and looked at me with the same determined expression she'd worn as a child when facing down playground bullies. "Because, Mom, people like Derek get overconfident. They make mistakes. And when they do, we'll be ready." As I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I thought about Derek's smile when Patricia had praised his initiative in completing the Henderson analysis. I remembered how he'd commiserated with me about the stress of keeping up with technology at our age. Our age. He'd been positioning himself as my natural successor while simultaneously sabotaging my reputation. One small detail blew the whole thing open. The next morning, I arrived at the office with a knot in my stomach that tightened as I approached my desk. Derek was already at his workstation, his back straight and posture confident as he typed with practiced efficiency. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across the maze of cubicles, making everything feel stark and unforgiving. I settled into my chair and immediately opened my project folder for the Whitmore account, a complex restructuring proposal I'd been developing for 3 weeks. My hands trembled slightly as I clicked through the directories, already dreading what I might find. The main proposal document was there, but when I opened it, my heart sank. The file contained only the basic template I'd started with weeks ago. 3 weeks of research, financial modeling, and strategic recommendations had vanished without a trace. The empty document mocked me from the screen, its blank pages like accusations of incompetence. "No, no, no," I whispered, frantically checking the backup folders and recent document history. Nothing. It was as if I'd never worked on the project beyond that first day. "Everything all right over there, Margaret?" Derek's voice carried that false concern I was beginning to recognize. He rolled his chair slightly toward me, his expression perfectly crafted to show collegial worry. I looked up at him, studying his face for any crack in the facade. His brown eyes held just the right amount of sympathy, his mouth turned down in a slight frown of concern. If I hadn't suspected what I now knew, I would have found his concern touching. "I'm having some technical difficulties," I said carefully, watching for his reaction. "Oh, that's frustrating. You know, I've been thinking about what we discussed regarding system backups. Maybe it's time to have IT take a look at your computer. Sometimes older hardware can develop glitches." There it was again. The subtle emphasis on older. The gentle suggestion that the problem was my equipment, my age, my declining capabilities. He delivered it with such apparent kindness that anyone overhearing would think he was being helpful. "I'll consider it," I replied, turning back to my screen. The morning crawled by as I tried to recreate the Whitmore proposal from memory and scattered printed notes I kept in my desk drawer. The familiar hum of office activity, keyboards clicking, phones ringing, the distant murmur of conversations, felt oppressive rather than comforting. Every sound seemed amplified. Every glance from a colleague felt loaded with judgment. Around 11, Patricia emerged from her corner office, her heels clicking authoritatively across the polished floor. She surveyed the workspace with the practiced eye of someone accustomed to command, her tailored blazer and perfectly styled hair projecting an image of uncompromising professionalism. "Margaret, how are we coming along with the Whitmore presentation? The client meeting is scheduled for Thursday." The blood drained from my face. Thursday was only 3 days away, and I was essentially starting from scratch. "I'm making good progress," I managed, hating how my voice sounded uncertain even to my own ears. Patricia's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a slight tightening around her eyes that suggested disappointment. "Good. I'm counting on you to deliver your usual quality work." After she walked away, I noticed Derek watching me with what appeared to be sympathy, but I caught something else in his expression. A fleeting look of satisfaction that he quickly masked. During lunch, I sat alone in my car in the parking lot, too anxious to eat the sandwich I'd brought. The autumn air was crisp and sharp, carrying the scent of dying leaves and the promise of winter. I called Sarah, needing to hear a friendly voice. "He's escalating," I told her, explaining about the Whitmore files. "It's not just about stealing my work anymore. He's actively trying to make me fail." Sarah's voice was tight with anger. "Mom, this has gone beyond workplace politics. This is deliberate sabotage." "But what can I do? I have 3 days to recreate weeks of work, and if I can't deliver, Patricia will have concrete proof that I'm slipping." "You're not slipping. You're being targeted. There's a difference." That afternoon, I threw myself into rebuilding the Whitmore proposal, drawing on every note and memory I could muster. The familiar process of analysis and strategy development began to calm me, reminding me why I'd succeeded in this field for so many years. My expertise hadn't disappeared overnight, no matter what Derek's sabotage might suggest. As the office emptied for the day, I remained at my desk, determined to make progress. The cleaning crew moved quietly through the space, their presence a reminder of how late it had grown. The overhead lights seemed harsher in the near-empty office, casting long shadows between the cubicles. Derek had left hours earlier, but I noticed he'd forgotten his coffee mug on his desk. An expensive-looking ceramic piece that seemed oddly personal in the sterile office environment. As I stretched my back and looked around the quiet space, something caught my eye. His computer monitor was still on, displaying his screensaver, but there was a small flash drive plugged into the side of his tower. In all the months we'd worked together, I'd never seen Derek use external storage devices. Most of our work was done on the company's internal network. I glanced around the empty office, my heart pounding. The cleaning crew had moved to a different floor, and the security guard was making his rounds in another part of the building. The silence was complete, except for the low hum of computers and air conditioning. Moving as quietly as I could, I approached Derek's workstation. The flash drive was small and black, nearly invisible against the dark plastic of the computer tower. My hands shook as I reached for it, every instinct screaming that I was crossing a line. But then I thought about the missing files, the stolen work, the systematic destruction of my reputation. I thought about Patricia's disappointed expression and the subtle satisfaction in Derek's eyes. I pulled out the flash drive and hurried back to my desk, plugging it into my computer with trembling fingers. The device contained dozens of files, and as I opened them, my worst fears were confirmed. There were my missing reports, my deleted analyses, my vanished presentations, all saved under Derek's name with creation dates that preceded mine. But there was more, much more. The drive contained detailed notes about my work habits, my computer password that I'd foolishly written on a sticky note weeks ago, and a document titled Transition Plan that outlined how Derek would gradually take over my client relationships and responsibilities. Most chilling of all was a folder labeled Insurance that contained screenshots of my supposedly incomplete work, carefully edited to make me look incompetent, along with what appeared to be a timeline for my anticipated termination. I stared at the screen, feeling sick. This wasn't just opportunistic theft. It was a calculated, long-term plan to destroy my career and replace me. Derek hadn't been admiring my work. He'd been studying it like a predator studies prey. The sound of footsteps in the hallway made me jump. I quickly ejected the flash drive and slipped it into my purse, my heart hammering against my ribs. The security guard appeared, making his rounds, nodding politely as he passed. "Working late, Mrs. Johnson?" "Just finishing up," I managed, grateful my voice sounded steadier than I felt. As I drove home through the dark streets, my mind raced with the implications of what I'd discovered. I had evidence now, proof of Derek's systematic sabotage, but I also had a flash drive that didn't belong to me. Using it could expose his crimes, but it might also destroy my own credibility if anyone questioned how I'd obtained it. The familiar streets of my neighborhood looked different somehow, as if the security and comfort I'd always felt here had been tainted by the knowledge of how vulnerable I really was. The warm glow from house windows that usually comforted me now seemed to emphasize my isolation. At home, Sarah was waiting in my kitchen, her laptop open on the table and a determined expression on her face. She looked up as I entered, immediately reading the stress in my posture and expression. "Mom, what happened?" I set my purse on the counter and looked at my daughter. Really looked at her. Her dark hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, and she wore the same focused expression she'd had as a teenager working on difficult homework problems. But now she was an adult, successful in her own right, and she was here because she believed in me. "I found proof," I said quietly, pulling out the flash drive. "But Sarah, what I had to do to get it—" Before I could explain further, my phone rang. Patricia's name appeared on the caller ID, and dread settled in my stomach like ice water. I stared at my phone as it continued ringing, Patricia's name flashing insistently on the screen. My hand trembled slightly as I reached for it, the weight of the flash drive in my other palm feeling heavier than something so small should. "Answer it," Sarah said softly, her eyes meeting mine across the kitchen table. "Whatever she has to say, we'll deal with it together." I swiped to accept the call, putting it on speaker so Sarah could hear. "Hello, Patricia?" "Margaret." Patricia's voice carried that particular tone I'd come to recognize, the one she used when delivering unpleasant news while trying to sound sympathetic. "I hope I'm not calling too late, but I wanted to speak with you about tomorrow's client presentation. The Morrison account." My blood ran cold. The Morrison account was my biggest client, a relationship I'd cultivated for 3 years. I'd spent weeks preparing for tomorrow's quarterly review presentation, perfecting every slide, every data point. It was the kind of presentation that could make or break the entire year's revenue projections. "What about it?" I managed to ask. "Well, Derek came to me this afternoon with some concerns. He said he'd been trying to reach you about some missing components in the presentation materials. When he couldn't get hold of you, he took the initiative to review the files himself." Patricia paused, and I could almost see her adjusting her glasses the way she did when delivering particularly difficult news. "Margaret, I have to ask, did you complete the market analysis section? Because Derek couldn't find it anywhere in the shared drive." Sarah's eyes widened, and she leaned forward, her laptop forgotten. I closed my eyes, feeling the familiar sick sensation that had become my constant companion these past few weeks. Of course, Derek had moved ahead with the next phase of his plan. Of course, he'd struck at my most important client relationship. "Patricia, I completed that analysis 2 days ago. It should be in the Morrison folder under Q4 deliverables." I fought to keep my voice steady, professional. "If Derek can't find it, perhaps there's been a technical issue with the shared drive." "I'm sure there's a simple explanation," Patricia said, though her tone suggested otherwise. "Derek has offered to stay late tonight to reconstruct what he can from his own notes and research. He's quite dedicated, you know. Always willing to step up when there's a crisis." The word crisis hung in the air like smoke. Sarah reached across the table and squeezed my free hand, her touch warm and reassuring in contrast to the ice spreading through my chest. "There's no crisis, Patricia. I can bring my backup files first thing in the morning, and we can resolve this quickly." I glanced at the flash drive still clutched in my palm. Somewhere in Derek's stolen files might be the evidence of what he'd done to my Morrison presentation, but I couldn't exactly explain how I'd obtained that information. "Actually, that's why I'm calling. Given the confusion around the presentation materials, I think it might be best if Derek takes the lead tomorrow. He's already familiar with the account from his backup work, and the client needs to see that we're completely prepared and professional." The words hit me like physical blows. Derek wouldn't just be stealing my work now. He'd be stealing my client relationship, standing in front of the Morrison executives and presenting himself as their new primary contact. 3 years of building trust, of understanding their business needs, of carefully nurturing a professional relationship that had grown into genuine mutual respect. And it would all be handed over to him in a single morning. "Patricia, I don't think that's necessary. I can have everything sorted out by morning." My voice cracked slightly on the last word, betraying the desperation I was trying so hard to hide. "I'm sorry, Margaret, but the decision is made. Derek will handle tomorrow's presentation. We can discuss your role going forward after we see how things go." The finality in her tone made it clear this wasn't a discussion. "I suggest you take tomorrow morning to organize your files and figure out what's been happening with your work organization lately. We'll need to have a more comprehensive conversation about that soon." The line went dead, leaving Sarah and me staring at each other across the kitchen table. The silence stretched between us, heavy with the weight of what had just happened. Outside, I could hear the distant hum of traffic, the normal sounds of a neighborhood settling into evening routines, completely oblivious to the fact that my professional life was crumbling. "Mom," Sarah said finally, her voice tight with anger. "He's not just stealing your files anymore. He's stealing your entire career." I nodded, unable to trust my voice. The flash drive felt warm now in my palm, and I set it carefully on the table between us. Such a small object to hold so much power. Evidence of Derek's systematic destruction of my professional reputation, but also potentially my own ethical downfall if I used information I'd obtained by breaking into his computer. Sarah opened her laptop again, her fingers flying over the keyboard with renewed purpose. "We're not letting him get away with this. What exactly did you find on that drive?" As I began to describe the contents of Derek's files, the timeline, the screenshots, the detailed notes about my work habits, Sarah's expression grew progressively more serious. Her dark eyes, so much like her father's, blazed with an intensity that reminded me of my own younger self, back when I'd believed that justice and hard work always prevailed. "The transition plan," she said when I finished. "That's the smoking gun. He's documented his entire scheme to replace you. But you're right about how you obtained it. That's going to be a problem if this becomes any kind of formal investigation." I slumped back in my chair, feeling the full weight of my situation. "So what do I do? Let him present my work to my client tomorrow and watch him take credit for 3 years of relationship building? Sit quietly while he systematically destroys everything I've worked for?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment, staring at her laptop screen with that focused expression that meant she was working through a complex problem. Finally, she looked up at me with a small, determined smile that I recognized from her childhood. The same expression she'd worn when she'd figured out how to build an impossible Lego creation or solve a math problem that had initially seemed beyond her abilities. "Actually, Mom, I think Derek might have just made his first real mistake." Before I could ask what she meant, my phone buzzed with a text message. Derek's name appeared on the screen, and my stomach clenched as I read his message. "Margaret, so sorry to hear about the confusion with the Morrison files. Don't worry, I'll make sure the presentation goes smoothly tomorrow. The client will be in good hands." The casual cruelty of it, the false sympathy masking his triumph, made my hands shake with anger. Sarah leaned over to read the message, and her jaw tightened. "Oh, he has no idea what he's about to walk into," she said quietly, her fingers already moving across her keyboard again. "What are you planning?" I asked Sarah, watching her fingers dance across the keyboard with the kind of focused intensity she'd inherited from me. "The apple never falls far from the tree," my mother used to say, and seeing Sarah work through a problem reminded me so much of myself at her age that it was almost unsettling. "Derek just documented his theft in writing," Sarah said without looking up from her screen. "That text message is going to be crucial evidence, but more importantly, he's assuming you're going to roll over and let this happen." The anger I'd been carrying for weeks was starting to crystallize into something harder and more useful: determination. I should have fought back sooner. I kept thinking if I just worked harder, if I could prove my worth more clearly. "Mom," Sarah's voice was gentle but firm, the same tone she'd used when she was 16 and trying to convince me that I was being too hard on myself about her father leaving. "You're not responsible for Derek's choices. You've been playing by the rules while he's been cheating. That doesn't make you weak. It makes you honest." My phone rang, startling us both. Derek's name appeared on the screen again, and I felt my stomach clench. Sarah nodded at me encouragingly as I answered. "Margaret, I hope you got my text." Derek's voice was smooth, professional, tinged with just enough false concern to make my skin crawl. "I wanted to reach out personally about tomorrow's presentation. I know how important the Morrison account is to you." The casual way he said it, as if he were doing me a favor, made something snap inside me. "Yes, Derek, the account I've been developing for 3 years. The relationship I built from nothing. Of course, of course. And your foundational work has been invaluable. I just want to make sure we don't leave the client hanging because of this unfortunate mix-up with the files. Sarah was watching my face intently, and I could see her taking mental notes of everything she was hearing from Derek's end of the conversation. Her expression reminded me of my father when he used to help me with homework. Patient, analytical, waiting for the right moment to guide me toward the solution. What mix-up would that be, Derek? I kept my voice level, professional. Well, when files go missing, sometimes it's hard to reconstruct all the work that went into them. I've been reviewing what I could recover, and I have to say, I think I can present a strong case to Morrison tomorrow. You don't need to worry about it. The sheer audacity of it left me momentarily speechless. Sarah grabbed a piece of paper and scribbled something, holding it up. Ask him about the timeline. I'm curious about your timeline for this recovery work, I said, following Sarah's lead. When did you first notice my files were missing? There was the slightest pause before Derek answered, and I knew Sarah had spotted something important. I'd been keeping backup copies of some of the key documents just as a precaution. You know how technology can be unreliable. Sarah was nodding vigorously, writing furiously on her paper. When Derek finally hung up after more false reassurances, she looked up at me with triumph in her eyes. He just contradicted his own documentation, she said. In those files you found, he recorded specific dates when he deleted your work. But he just told you he's had backup copies all along, as a precaution. He can't have it both ways. I felt a spark of hope for the first time in weeks. So, what do we do with that? We build a case that doesn't rely on the stolen files, Sarah said, her voice gaining excitement. We use what he just gave us willingly, combined with what you can prove through other means. Before I could ask what she meant, my phone buzzed with another text. This time, it wasn't Derek. It was my boss, requesting a meeting first thing in the morning before the Morrison presentation. My blood ran cold. Sarah read the message over my shoulder and squeezed my hand. He's moving faster than we thought. But Mom, I think I know how to stop him. The determination in her voice reminded me that she was my daughter, stubborn, brilliant, and absolutely unwilling to back down from a fight when she believed in something. But as I looked at the meeting request, I realized that Derek might have already won, and tomorrow could be the end of everything I'd worked for. Sarah was already pulling out her laptop before I could fully process the implications of Morrison's early meeting request. The clicking of keys filled my kitchen as she opened multiple windows, her face illuminated by the blue glow of the screen. Mom, tell me everything you remember about the projects Derek claimed you never finished. Start with the dates, even approximate ones. I sat down heavily in the chair beside her, my mind racing. The Hartwell account analysis was due 3 weeks ago. I submitted it on a Thursday evening around 6:30 because I remember staying late to polish the executive summary. Good. What else? The quarterly budget review. I finished that 2 Mondays ago. I even emailed Derek afterward to confirm he'd received it, and he responded with that thumbs-up emoji he always uses. I paused, remembering something else. Actually, I forwarded a copy to my personal email that same day, because I wanted to reference the formatting for another project. Sarah's fingers stopped moving across the keyboard. You still have that copy? I should. I reached for my phone, scrolling through my personal email. The familiar subject line appeared, and I felt my first genuine smile in days. Here it is, complete with timestamp showing I sent it to myself right after submitting the original. Perfect, that's our smoking gun for at least one project. Sarah turned the laptop screen toward me. Look at what I found in the metadata of those files you retrieved from Derek's folder. The technical details on the screen might as well have been hieroglyphics, But Sarah's excitement was contagious. She pointed to a series of timestamps and file modifications. See this? Derek accessed and deleted your Hartwell analysis at 11:23 p.m. on the day it was due. But here's the beautiful part. The system logs show he opened the file and viewed it for exactly 17 minutes before deleting it. You can't spend 17 minutes reviewing a file that doesn't exist. I stared at the screen, finally understanding what my daughter had discovered. So he read my work before destroying it. Not just read it. The modification log shows he copied sections of it. He literally stole your analysis, deleted the original, and then probably reformatted it as his own work. Sarah's voice carried a mix of anger and professional admiration. Mom, this isn't just workplace sabotage. This is theft of intellectual property. The front door opened with Michael's familiar pattern of sounds. Keys dropping in the bowl, jacket being hung up, the soft thud of his work bag hitting the hall floor. He appeared in the kitchen doorway, took one look at Sarah's laptop and my expression, and immediately pulled out a chair. I take it the Derek situation has evolved, he said, loosening his tie. Sarah launched into an explanation of everything we'd discovered, from Derek's contradictory phone call to the metadata evidence. Michael listened with the same focused attention he'd always given to Sarah's school presentations, asking clarifying questions and nodding at key points. The meeting tomorrow morning is obviously Derek's attempt to get ahead of any accusations, Michael said when Sarah finished. He wants to present his stolen version of your work before you have a chance to defend yourself. But we have proof now, I protested. Sarah found evidence that he copied my files. Michael's expression was gentle but realistic. Honey, how do you plan to present that evidence? You obtained it by accessing Derek's computer files without permission. Even if it proves your case completely, it might not be admissible in any formal proceeding. The hope that had been building in my chest deflated slightly. So, we're back where we started. Not necessarily, Sarah interjected. Dad's right that the stolen files might be problematic, but Derek gave us something else during that phone call. He admitted to having backup copies of Mom's work. If he truly had legitimate backup copies, why wouldn't he have mentioned them weeks ago when the files first went missing? Michael leaned forward, his analytical mind clearly engaging with the problem. You're thinking we use his own contradictions against him? Exactly. And we have Mom's personal email copy of the budget review, which she can legitimately present as evidence of completion. Plus, there might be other digital breadcrumbs we haven't considered yet. What kind of breadcrumbs? I asked. Sarah turned back to her laptop. Email timestamps, server logs that IT could access legitimately, maybe even calendar entries showing when you worked on specific projects. Derek's been so focused on deleting your final submissions that he probably didn't think about all the peripheral evidence that supports your version of events. Michael stood up and moved to the coffee maker. You need a strategy for tomorrow morning's meeting. Even with evidence, you're going to be walking into a room where Derek has already shaped the narrative. The reality of tomorrow's confrontation hit me again, and I felt my confidence wavering. What if Morrison doesn't believe me? What if Derek's presentation is so polished that my evidence looks like desperate backpedaling? Sarah closed her laptop and turned to face me fully. Mom, do you remember when I was in high school and Jenny Kowalski plagiarized my history paper? I nodded, remembering the incident that had taught Sarah valuable lessons about standing up for herself. You told me something that night that I've never forgotten. You said that the truth doesn't have to be the loudest voice in the room, but it does have to be the most consistent one. Derek's story has holes in it, big ones. We just need to present your truth clearly and let those inconsistencies speak for themselves. Michael returned with 3 mugs of coffee, the familiar domestic ritual somehow steadying my nerves. Sarah's right. Derek's gotten sloppy because he thought he was completely in control of the situation. but overconfidence leads to mistakes. So, what's our plan? I asked, accepting the warm mug gratefully. Sarah reopened her laptop. We spend tonight documenting everything we can prove without using the stolen files. Every email, every calendar entry, every legitimate piece of evidence that shows you completed your assigned work. Then we prepare responses to Derek's likely accusations based on the contradictions he's already revealed. And we practice, Michael added. You need to be able to present your case calmly and professionally, even if Derek tries to throw you off balance. As my daughter and husband began outlining our strategy for tomorrow's meeting, I felt something I hadn't experienced in weeks. The sense that I wasn't fighting this battle alone. But even with their support and the evidence we'd gathered, I knew that tomorrow would determine whether Derek's sabotage had succeeded in destroying everything I'd worked to build. The kitchen clock ticked past 9 p.m., and I realized we had less than 12 hours to prepare for what might be the most important meeting of my career. We worked until nearly midnight, with Sarah creating a detailed timeline on her laptop while Michael and I went through my email archives methodically. The kitchen table had transformed into our war room, covered with printed emails, my work calendar, and pages of handwritten notes. "Look at this," Sarah said, pointing at her screen. "Derek claimed you never submitted the Henderson project proposal, but here's an email thread where you and Morrison were discussing revisions to that exact proposal 3 days after Derek says it was never turned in." I leaned over to read the email chain, my heart racing as I saw Morrison's detailed feedback on work Derek insisted I'd never completed. I'd forgotten about those revision requests. Morrison wouldn't have been giving me specific notes on formatting and content if I hadn't submitted anything. Michael looked up from the stack of calendar printouts he'd been reviewing. "And here's another inconsistency. Derek told Morrison you missed the deadline for the Brennan account analysis by a week, but your calendar shows you had a meeting scheduled specifically to discuss that analysis 2 days before his supposed deadline." "Did the meeting actually happen?" Sarah asked, her fingers already moving across the keyboard. I closed my eyes, trying to remember that particular Tuesday. Yes, Morrison and I met for almost an hour. He had questions about the demographic data I'd included. A memory surfaced suddenly. He even complimented my research methodology. He said it was the most thorough analysis he'd seen in months. Sarah's typing intensified. Perfect. Because if Derek's claiming you never completed that project, but Morrison was discussing your methodology in detail, that creates a major hole in Derek's story. The evidence was mounting, but I still felt a gnawing anxiety about tomorrow's confrontation. Derek had seemed so confident, so prepared during our hallway encounter. What if he has explanations for all of these inconsistencies? What if he's thought through every angle? Michael set down his coffee mug and looked at me seriously. "Honey, remember what you always tell Sarah about overthinking her presentations. You can prepare for the most likely scenarios, but at some point, you have to trust that the truth will hold up under scrutiny." "But Derek's been planning this for who knows how long," I said, feeling the familiar wave of overwhelm washing over me. "He's had time to craft his story perfectly." Sarah closed her laptop and reached across the table to squeeze my hand. "Mom, that's actually working against him now. He's been so committed to his narrative that he couldn't adjust when you started asking questions. Those confident responses he gave Morrison weren't carefully considered. They were reflexive lies to cover his tracks." I wanted to believe her, but the stakes felt enormous. If this goes badly tomorrow, I could lose my job. After 15 years with the company, I could be walking out with nothing. The kitchen fell silent except for the hum of the refrigerator. Michael gathered up the printed emails and tapped them into a neat stack. That's the fear talking, and it's understandable. But look at what we've documented here. Derek's story doesn't just have a few minor inconsistencies. It has fundamental contradictions that he can't explain away. Sarah reopened her laptop one more time. Let me show you something else I found while you two were going through the calendars. She turned the screen toward me. Remember the coastal industries presentation you supposedly never completed? I nodded, remembering Derek's smug satisfaction when he'd mentioned that particular project to Morrison. Well, I found an email where Morrison forwarded your presentation slides to the client, along with a note praising your innovative approach to their budget constraints. He sent that email the day after Derek claimed you'd missed the deadline entirely. The significance of this discovery hit me like a physical blow. Morrison forwarded my actual work to the client. There's no way Derek can explain that away. Michael leaned back in his chair, and for the first time all evening, I saw him smile. Derek got so focused on the immediate goal of making you look incompetent that he forgot Morrison would have his own records of your interactions. We spent another hour organizing our evidence and anticipating Derek's possible responses. Sarah created a clean document summarizing our findings, while Michael helped me practice presenting the information calmly and professionally. By the time we finally headed to bed, I felt as prepared as possible, but sleep proved elusive. I lay awake thinking about Derek's confidence, about the way Morrison had seemed to believe his version of events so readily. What if our evidence wasn't as solid as we thought? What if Derek had prepared for this possibility? The next morning arrived gray and drizzly, matching my mood perfectly. I dressed carefully in my most professional suit, knowing that perception would matter almost as much as facts in the upcoming meeting. Sarah had already left for classes, but she'd stuck a note to the coffee maker. Remember, the truth doesn't have to be the loudest voice in the room. You've got this, Mom. Michael drove me to work, both of us quiet during the commute. As he pulled up to my building, he turned to me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Whatever happens in there, we'll figure it out together. But I have a feeling Derek's about to discover that sabotaging someone's career is harder than he thought. I gathered my bag and the folder containing our carefully organized evidence, taking a deep breath before opening the car door. The meeting was scheduled for 9 a.m., giving me just 30 minutes to settle in and make final preparations. As I walked through the lobby toward the elevator, I saw Derek already waiting, looking remarkably composed for someone who was about to be confronted with evidence of his sabotage. His confidence sent a chill through me, and I found myself wondering what surprises he might have prepared for this morning's showdown. The elevator ride to the 4th floor felt interminable, my reflection in the polished steel doors showing a woman who looked far more composed than she felt. The evidence folder seemed to weigh more with each passing floor, and I found myself rehearsing key phrases from our late-night preparation session. When the doors opened, the familiar hum of office activity greeted me, but everything felt different now. The copy machine where Derek had intercepted my documents, the shared printer where files had mysteriously vanished, even the break room where he'd made his subtle comments about my declining performance. Every corner of this space now held new significance. I made my way to my desk, noting that Derek had already settled into his workspace across the aisle. He appeared to be reviewing documents with the kind of focused attention that suggested preparation rather than routine morning tasks. When he glanced up and offered his usual pleasant smile, the casual normalcy of it made my skin crawl. "Morning," he said, his tone carrying just the right amount of professional friendliness. "Big day today, huh?" The comment could have been innocent, referring to any number of upcoming projects, but the timing felt deliberate. I managed a neutral response before turning to my computer, using the familiar routine of checking emails to steady my nerves. Morrison's office door remained closed, and I could see light spilling from underneath, suggesting he'd arrived early as well. The morning stretched ahead with agonizing slowness, each minute bringing me closer to a confrontation that would fundamentally change my relationship with this workplace, regardless of the outcome. At 8:45, I gathered the evidence folder and made my way toward Morrison's office. Derek rose from his desk at almost the same moment, falling into step beside me with an ease that suggested this coordination wasn't accidental. "You know," he said quietly as we walked, "I've been thinking about our recent project challenges. Sometimes when we're under stress, our memory of events can get a little fuzzy. I hope we can clear everything up in a way that works for everyone." The subtle threat embedded in his reasonable tone made me grip the folder more tightly. He was already laying groundwork for an explanation that would paint me as confused or overwhelmed rather than sabotaged. Morrison's office occupied a corner position with windows overlooking the parking lot where Michael had dropped me off just an hour earlier. The space reflected his methodical personality. Organized shelves lined with project binders, a clean desk with documents arranged in precise stacks, and framed certificates that spoke to decades of professional achievement. He gestured for us to take the 2 chairs positioned in front of his desk, and I found myself hyper-aware of every detail. The soft leather of the chair, the faint scent of coffee from Morrison's mug, the way morning light filtered through partially closed blinds to create patterns on the carpet. "I asked for this meeting because we need to address some concerns about project coordination and deadline management," Morrison began, his tone neutral but serious. "There seems to be some disconnect between assigned tasks and completed deliverables." Derek leaned forward slightly, projecting an air of helpful concern. "I appreciate you bringing us together on this. I've been worried about some of the communication gaps we've been experiencing." The phrase communication gaps was expertly chosen, I realized. It suggested mutual responsibility for problems while avoiding direct accusations. But as Derek continued speaking, outlining his version of missed deadlines and incomplete assignments, I felt my earlier nervousness transform into something clearer and more focused. This was exactly the scenario we'd anticipated. Derek's confidence stemmed from his belief that I had no way to prove my version of events. He'd been careful, methodical, and probably successful with this approach before. But he'd made one crucial miscalculation. When Morrison turned to me for my response, I opened the evidence folder with steady hands. The hours of preparation with Sarah and Michael had given me something Derek couldn't have anticipated. Not just proof, but the clarity that comes from knowing you're absolutely right. "I understand Derek's concerns," I began, "but I think there might be some confusion about what actually happened with these projects. I'd like to share some documentation that might help clarify the timeline." As I began laying out the printed emails and file logs, I watched Derek's expression closely. For just a moment, his composed mask slipped, revealing a flicker of genuine surprise. He recovered quickly, but that instant of recognition told me everything I needed to know. He hadn't expected me to fight back, and he certainly hadn't expected me to come prepared. But as Morrison began examining the documents, reaching for his own computer to cross-reference the information, Derek's surprise transformed into something more calculating. The slight smile that played at the corners of his mouth suggested he still had cards to play that I hadn't anticipated. Morrison pulled his keyboard closer, his fingers moving across the keys as he pulled up what appeared to be system logs on his monitor. The soft clicking filled the momentary silence, and I found myself holding my breath as he cross-referenced my documentation with whatever he was seeing on his screen. "These timestamps are interesting," Morrison said, adjusting his reading glasses. "Derek, You mentioned that the Hartwell proposal was never submitted, but I'm seeing file activity here that suggests otherwise. Derek's posture remained relaxed, but I caught the way his fingers tightened almost imperceptibly on the arm of his chair. File activity can be misleading sometimes, he said smoothly. Creating a document isn't the same as completing it. I think what happened is that preliminary work was started but never finished to the standards we needed. The subtle shift in his strategy was masterful. He wasn't denying the evidence outright, but reframing it in a way that still positioned him as the reasonable party dealing with substandard work. Morrison looked up from his screen, his expression thoughtful. Walk me through your process, Derek. When you realized the proposal wasn't meeting standards, what steps did you take? Well, that's part of what made this situation so difficult, Derek replied, spreading his hands in a gesture that suggested reluctant honesty. I kept expecting to see revisions, improvements, follow-up communication. When deadlines started approaching and I wasn't seeing the progress I expected, I had to make some difficult decisions about resource allocation. I felt a familiar knot forming in my stomach. Even with all my preparation, Derek was managing to sound entirely reasonable. His version painted me as someone who started work but couldn't follow through, who left colleagues scrambling to cover for my shortcomings. The thing is, I said, surprised by the steadiness in my own voice, I did follow up, multiple times. I pulled out another set of printed emails. These show my attempts to get clarification on the revisions Derek mentioned and my requests for feedback on the completed drafts. Morrison accepted the papers, scanning them quickly. These are addressed to Derek, asking for review comments and approval to proceed. Derek, do you remember receiving these? The pause that followed was barely noticeable, but I caught it. Derek's smile never wavered as he leaned forward slightly, projecting helpful concern. You know, this actually highlights something I've been worried about, Derek said, his tone taking on a note of gentle regret. I think there might be some technical issues we need to look into. I never received those emails, and frankly, this isn't the first time I've noticed communications seeming to disappear. Morrison's eyebrows raised slightly. Technical issues? Email problems, file syncing difficulties. It's been intermittent, which makes it hard to pin down. Derek turned to me with what appeared to be genuine sympathy. I'm wondering if you've been experiencing similar issues. It would certainly explain some of the confusion we've been having. The brilliance of his pivot took my breath away. In a matter of seconds, he'd transformed my evidence from proof of his sabotage into evidence of mysterious technical problems that conveniently affected our communications. It positioned him as equally victimized by these supposed system failures while maintaining his narrative about my incomplete work. Morrison was making notes now, his pen moving across a yellow legal pad. This is concerning. If we're having system reliability issues that are affecting project coordination, that's something IT needs to address immediately. I felt the careful foundation Sarah, Michael, and I had built threatening to crumble. Derek had found a way to acknowledge my evidence while completely neutralizing its impact. Worse, he'd done it in a way that made him appear collaborative and solution-focused. Actually, I said, reaching for the last folder in my stack, I think these server logs might help clarify what's been happening with our files. Derek's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, the confident smile flickering for just a moment before returning full force. But in that brief pause, I saw something I recognized from our previous encounters, the look of someone rapidly recalculating their approach. Server logs? Morrison asked, accepting the folder. How did you access server logs? As I began to explain, I noticed Derek had gone very still in his chair, his earlier relaxed posture replaced by something more watchful. Whatever cards he'd been preparing to play, he was suddenly reconsidering his hand. I reached out to Sarah in IT for help understanding what was happening with our files. I explained, watching Morrison flip through the printed logs. She was able to pull access records for the shared project folders over the past 6 weeks. Derek's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. I'm not sure involving IT was necessary at this stage. We could have worked through these communication issues internally. Actually, I think this was exactly the right approach, Morrison said, studying the timestamps on the logs. If we're dealing with system problems, we need technical documentation to understand the scope. He looked up at me. Walk me through what these show. I took a breath, knowing this was my critical moment. The logs show file access patterns for all our shared project directories. You can see here, I pointed to the first page, where I uploaded the Morrison Industries analysis on October 15th at 2:47 p.m. The file shows as successfully saved to the shared folder. Morrison nodded, following along. And then, what happened to it? If you look at the next entry, the same file was accessed and deleted on October 16th at 8:23 a.m. I glanced at Derek, whose face had gone carefully neutral. The deletion was performed from Derek's user account. Now hold on, Derek interjected, his voice taking on a slightly sharper edge despite his attempt to maintain his reasonable tone. If my account shows that activity, it could be a security issue. Account compromises aren't uncommon, especially with these system problems we've been experiencing. Morrison made another note. That's a possibility we'd need to investigate. He continued reading through the logs. But I'm seeing a pattern here. Multiple files uploaded from your account. He nodded toward me. And then deleted from Derek's account, all within 12 to 24 hours. Which is exactly why I think we need to involve our security team, Derek said. If someone's been using my credentials to delete files, that's a serious breach that goes way beyond project coordination issues. I felt a flash of admiration for Derek's tactical thinking, even as frustration mounted. He was systematically creating alternative explanations for every piece of evidence, always positioning himself as another victim rather than the perpetrator. There's more, I said quietly. Sarah was able to recover some of the deleted files from the backup systems. The deletion commands weren't random or bulk deletions that might indicate a security breach. Each file was individually selected and removed, and only files related to projects where Derek was the reviewing manager were affected. Derek was quiet for a long moment, and I could practically see him weighing his options. When he spoke, his voice carried a note of hurt disappointment that was masterfully executed. I have to say, this feels like a pretty serious accusation. The fact that you went to IT to pull access logs on my account without talking to me first suggests you've already decided I'm somehow responsible for these problems. He turned to Morrison with an expression of wounded professionalism. I'm concerned about the work environment implications here. Morrison set down the folder and leaned back in his chair. Let's take a step back. Whether we're dealing with technical issues, security breaches, or interpersonal problems, the bottom line is that project deliverables aren't reaching their destinations and work is getting lost. That's affecting client relationships and team productivity. He looked between Derek and me. I need to understand exactly what happened with the Morrison Industries project specifically. You're telling me, he addressed me, that you completed the analysis, uploaded it for review, and sent Derek notification emails? That's correct. And Derek, you're saying you never received those emails or saw the uploaded file? Derek nodded gravely. That's right. And if these logs are accurate, it appears my account was used to delete files I never knew existed in the first place. Morrison picked up his phone. I'm going to need to bring Sarah from IT into this conversation. If we're dealing with compromised accounts or system failures affecting multiple projects, this is bigger than a departmental issue. Derek straightened in his chair. Of course. I think that's the right approach. We need to get to the bottom of these technical problems. But I caught something in his voice, a slight strain that hadn't been there before. For the first time since we'd entered Morrison's office, Derek seemed less certain of his ability to control the narrative. As Morrison dialed Sarah's extension, I realized we were about to find out whether Derek's quick thinking could hold up under technical scrutiny from someone who understood exactly what the server logs revealed. "Sarah, could you join us in my office? We need to discuss some IT security concerns that have come up." Sarah arrived within minutes, carrying a laptop and wearing the focused expression of someone who'd clearly been reviewing technical data since Morrison's call. She settled into the remaining chair and opened her computer without preamble. "I've been digging deeper into the access patterns we discussed," she said, glancing at Derek before turning to Morrison. "The technical evidence is quite clear about what happened, but I wanted to verify a few additional details before presenting my findings." Derek maintained his composed demeanor, but I noticed his hands had moved to rest flat on his knees, fingers pressed down slightly. "I appreciate the thoroughness. If my account was compromised, we need to understand the scope of the breach." Sarah pulled up a screen full of data logs. "That's the interesting thing. The access patterns don't match what we typically see with compromised accounts. External breaches usually involve bulk downloads, attempts to access multiple systems, or unusual login times. What we're seeing here is very targeted and occurs during normal business hours from Derek's usual workstation." Morrison leaned forward. "Walk us through what that means." Each deletion required Derek's login credentials and followed the same pattern. Login, navigate directly to specific project files, delete only work submitted by our colleague here, then log out. The person doing this knew exactly which files to target and where to find them. Derek shifted in his chair. "But if someone had my password, they could easily mimic my normal work patterns to avoid detection." "True," Sarah acknowledged. "But there are other digital fingerprints we can examine. Keystroke patterns, mouse movement speeds, even the specific way someone navigates through folder structures. These behavioral biometrics are much harder to fake." She clicked through several screens of data. The deletion activities show identical patterns to Derek's normal file management behavior. Same typing rhythm, same navigation shortcuts, even the same tendency to pause briefly before confirming delete actions. The room fell silent except for the quiet hum of Sarah's laptop. Derek's professional mask was beginning to show hairline cracks, though he was fighting to maintain it. Morrison studied the data Sarah had presented. "So, you're saying this wasn't an external breach or someone else using Derek's credentials?" "The evidence strongly suggests these deletions were performed by someone with intimate knowledge of Derek's work habits and access patterns. Combined with the fact that only projects where Derek served as reviewing manager were affected, and only work submitted by one specific team member, the technical indicators point to intentional, targeted actions." Derek straightened in his chair, and I could see him calculating his next move. "I understand how this might look from a technical standpoint, but I have to ask if there could be other explanations. Perhaps someone observed my work patterns closely enough to replicate them?" Sarah shook her head. "The behavioral biometrics I'm referring to include unconscious micro-movements and timing patterns. They're not something someone could observe and replicate without sophisticated analysis tools." Morrison was quiet for a long moment, processing everything he'd heard. Finally, he spoke directly to Derek. "Given the technical evidence and the specific pattern of which files were affected, I need to ask you directly. Did you delete these project files?" Derek looked around the room, his gaze lingering on each of us. The confident, slightly wounded professional demeanor he'd maintained throughout the meeting was finally beginning to crumble. When he spoke, his voice was quieter, less certain. "I think we need to consider the bigger picture here. There have been ongoing performance concerns, missed deadlines, quality issues with deliverables. Sometimes management has to make difficult decisions about work products that don't meet standards. It wasn't quite an admission, but it wasn't a denial either. Morrison caught the shift immediately. Are you saying you deleted files because you determined they were substandard? I'm saying that ensuring quality control is part of my responsibilities as a reviewing manager. Sarah closed her laptop with a decisive click. Quality control typically involves feedback and revision requests, not secretly deleting work and claiming it was never submitted. Derek's composure finally broke. Look, we all know there have been performance issues. Rather than going through lengthy documentation processes and formal reviews, I thought it would be more efficient to simply request the work be redone to proper standards. Morrison's expression hardened. By making it appear that the work was never completed in the first place? By letting team members believe they were failing to meet basic job requirements? I was trying to avoid formal disciplinary procedures. No, I said, finding my voice again. You were trying to create a paper trail that would support disciplinary procedures, making it look like I consistently failed to complete assignments. Derek didn't respond, but his silence was answer enough. Morrison stood up, signaling that the meeting was moving toward its conclusion. Derek, I need to suspend your system access pending a full review of this situation. We'll need to examine all projects you've managed over the past 6 months to determine the scope of these deletions. Additionally, I'll be meeting with HR first thing tomorrow morning to discuss appropriate disciplinary measures. This behavior represents a serious breach of professional conduct and has created a hostile work environment. Derek nodded stiffly. His earlier confidence completely evaporated. I understand. As we filed out of Morrison's office, Sarah lingered to speak with me privately. I'm glad you came forward about this. The technical evidence was clear, but these situations can be difficult to address without someone willing to document and report the pattern. Thank you for taking it seriously and doing such thorough analysis. That's what the data is for. I'll be working with Morrison over the next few days to restore all the deleted files from our backup systems and review the audit trails on other projects Derek managed. Walking back to my desk, I felt a complex mixture of relief, vindication, and exhaustion. Months of self-doubt and anxiety about my job performance were finally lifting, replaced by the satisfaction of having stood up for myself professionally. The situation with Derek would likely take weeks to fully resolve through proper HR channels, but the immediate threat to my work and reputation was over. More importantly, I'd learned valuable lessons about documenting problems, seeking help from the right resources, and trusting my instincts when something felt wrong. Sometimes workplace problems require more than just working harder or trying to please difficult colleagues. Sometimes they require careful documentation, technical investigation, and the courage to escalate issues through proper channels when patterns of problematic behavior emerge.